My name is Justine Rosenthal. I am the editor of the National Interest, and we are here today with Matthew Alexander, who has done the cover story for our March-April issue, and it is How to Turn a Terrorist, in essence. What we can do in interrogation techniques that don't border on torture, that don't get into that sort of debate, but rather, are there other ways, better ways, potentially more effective ways, to address our radicalization and terrorism problem? So if you could just start by talking a little bit about the man at the centerpiece of this article, who was an Indonesian interrogator. Tell us a little bit about him.
Tito Carnarvon is in charge of Indonesia's Detachment 88, which is their special police unit that's aimed specifically at counterterrorism. And Tito Carnarvon is kind of an interesting case study because Indonesians, obviously, their police force has been fairly renowned for using brutal methods of interrogation. But this unit, Detachment 88, was stood up after the Bali bombing. And it was funded and trained by the U.S. And Tito Carnarvon originally was its chief of intelligence, and he was the one that ran the interrogations. And at the beginning, they kind of struggled in getting people to talk and in rounding up terrorists. But Tito basically took on the philosophy that there's got to be a better way of interrogating than using brutal methods. And what he did is he came up with a system of analyzing detainees according to basically their commitment to the ideology of radical Islam, and then their position. And then he tailored his interrogations based on that analysis and started using things like incentives to convince people to cooperate with the police.
Now tell me, you were sort of were you head interrogator in Iraq? Did you have some kind of official title like that?
My background is, I was the senior military interrogator for the task force that I worked for in Iraq.
And you were chiefly responsible for getting the information that caught Zarqawi?
My team was, yes. It was a chain link of events.
Right. Well, how did that experience contrast with what you're now seeing this detachment? I mean, you were successful in what you and your team set out to do. It sounds to me like what you did there was very different than what was being done in a lot of other American interrogations. How does all of this compare to this sort of very unique Indonesian experience?
Well, what I can say about my team in Iraq is that our interrogation methods, what we did that I think was new, that was different, is we took law enforcement techniques. Because I was a federal law enforcement officer for the Air Force before I went to Iraq. And I took that experience from law enforcement and blended it in with the Army techniques in the Army Field Manual, and then tailored it specifically for the culture in Iraq. And I taught that to my team, and by doing that, our success level rose dramatically. But what we didn't have at our disposal in Iraq was the ability to give very potent incentives.
And and what are these kinds of incentives that I assume you would like to see us doing this more as we're going into Afghanistan and creating a whole new set of detainees. What kinds of incentives are we talking about?
Well, under the Army Field Manual, there's a whole approach called incentives. But the reality on the ground is that as an interrogator, even as a senior interrogator, running an interrogation team, the best I could give was maybe an extra meal or extra blanket or something very small. We could, of course, you can promise that you're going to talk to authorities and try to get somebody leniency if they cooperate, and that's the truth. They will get leniency by the court if they cooperate. But I can't offer to pay somebody's family for the rest of their life. I can't offer any type of visa to somebody who might want to move their family out of a country where they'd be threatened if they cooperated. The Indonesians, what they've done, what's new, is they've applied these very strong incentives. They'll go to a detainee's family and say, or go to a detainee and say, we'll support your family financially for the rest of your life if you cooperate with us. And they're not looking for the detainees to renounce the political aims of the movement, in the case of Indonesia, Jemaah Islamiyah. What they're looking for is just for them to renounce violence and to become advocates against violence.
Well, tell me a little bit about the distinction. What are the aims of the group that are acceptable in terms of Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, or even what we're going to be talking about in Afghanistan, or with Al-Qaeda? What is it that would pass your test of acceptable enough, as long as it's not violent?
Well, what did we accept in Iraq? I mean, with the Sunnis, we were able to instigate, if you will, the Anbar awakening by offering money and arms to the Sunni sheikhs in Anbar province. And what did we accept in return for that? They renounced violence. They never renounced their aim to be able to gain shares of wealth in Iraq that would enable them to have jobs and to be able to feed their families, which was their chief concern in the first place. It's a little trickier in Afghanistan because unlike Sunnis in Iraq, in Afghanistan, some of, I think a larger portion of the movement, whether it's Taliban or Al-Qaeda, is more extreme in terms of what they would want in terms of government, where there's not a lot of ideologically committed Sunni Iraqis in terms of Al-Qaeda ideology. So I think it's a little bit more difficult in Afghanistan, where you do have ideology is playing a larger role. But I still think, even if Afghanistan, a lot of the concerns are not ideological. It's about money, it's about providing jobs, it's about social issues.
And what about now that we're beginning to see a potential homegrown Islamist terrorism problem, which seems much more inspired by a sort of Al-Qaeda type ideology? How do we use the techniques you're suggesting in those cases? I mean, in some ways that seems oddly even more complex to me than the Afghanistan case.
Well, I think if you're talking about in terms of interrogating homegrown terrorists who subscribe to Al-Qaeda ideology, obviously there's certain aspects of American culture that would influence your interrogation strategies that would be very different than interrogating somebody from the Middle East or from Afghanistan. Because culture plays a huge part in interrogation strategy. There's no blanket vanilla formula for interrogating. You always have to add in the flavor of culture. But in terms of the U.S., I don't think that Islamic extremism is necessarily a reason to change our strategies. It's another reason for people to resort to violence because they oppose something our government does or some things that are happening personally in their life. And so I think the interrogation strategies basically have to be tailored for each individual, and to do that you have to understand why they joined this group or decided to resort to violence.
So, bottom line, what are we still doing wrong? And what would you like to see change on a very sort of practical level? Because we're hearing about still, murmurs that behaviors we were told were not happening anymore may still be happening. There's still a lot of controversy about where to try detainees, how to deal with detainees, what we're going to do with all of these new Afghan prisoners. Has anything changed?
Well, I think first of all, we have to quit approaching interrogations as this tactical thing that's just a short-term fix and that's it. That its only use is to get information that'll stop another terrorist attack. Interrogations can be used, like the Indonesians have shown, as a strategic tool. If you turn people, mid and high-level leaders, especially religious leaders, to your side and get them to speak outwardly against violence, that's a strategic win. And interrogations can become a strategic weapon that way. And the U.S. is not using interrogations that way. We're using it solely to get tactical intelligence information. So that's one thing I think we definitely could learn from the Indonesians and apply, and it would be very successful. And I think we're seeing signs that we're doing some of that in Afghanistan, where they're offering incentives to Taliban fighters to change sides and to work for the government. And that's the right thing to do. That's the way you can effectively use interrogations to solve an insurgency.
All right, well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I appreciate it. Hopefully we can do it again soon and get an update on how General McChrystal and all are dealing with the problem.
Yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you.